Rome, 2,000 years ago, was the world's first ancient megacity. In a world where few towns had more than 10,000 inhabitants, more than 1 million people lived in Rome. It would take almost 1,800 years for any other city in the West to achieve the same population. How did they manage without all the technologies our modern cities rely on? Technologies of transport, communication, energy. How did they get enough food and drink to the population? How did they house them? How did they maintain law and order? How did they make this great city work? I'll show you how Rome surpassed all the cities that had gone before and rose to many of the challenges faced by megacities today. By taking you on a journey up ancient tower blocks. What I love is that this isn't just a bit of archaeology, it's a bit of living history. Incredible infrastructure.
E siamo proprio sotto il foro.
And some very proud people. Fantastico. Making a city of 1 million work in ancient conditions was an enormous challenge. But in 31 BC, one man, who would become the Emperor Augustus, became Rome's undisputed ruler. His role was to maintain peace across all his imperial territories. But if Augustus couldn't run his capital, he couldn't run an empire. So, in rising to the challenge, he set new standards for how a city could be organized. So, historians are always chucking around numbers for how many inhabitants there were in cities. How do they know? And to be honest, a lot of the time they're bluffing. But with the case of Rome under Augustus, we've got an amazing bit of evidence here. This is Augustus' own account of all his achievements. Augustus was obsessed with numbers. How many victories did he win? How many cities did he found? How many laws did he pass? And he loved counting the citizens. Censum populi, I did a census of the people. That is, of course, the citizens in all the empire. Luckily, in the case of Rome, he also counted the number of inhabitants of the city. Because they were very privileged citizens, he gave them cash handouts. And he says, on no single occasion did I give the money to less than 250,000 people. And on one occasion, I gave it to 320,000 people, nearly 1/3 of 1 million people. And that is just adult male citizens. Where are the women? Where are the children? Where are the slaves? And where are the immigrants? It's clear you've got to multiply up. 1 million is the figure people chuck around as the population of Rome. To be honest, that's a minimum. In my view, you could be talking about 1.5 million people. It is an absolutely enormous number for antiquity. There had been other great capitals before Rome. So how was this city able to achieve what they could not? Perhaps the most obvious competitor should have been Athens. And indeed, early Rome was developing at the same time. They both embraced one common and powerful idea: the citizen. SPQR. Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. Those were the initials of authority of the citizen body itself. Populus Romanus, the citizens of Rome. In antiquity, that was their symbol of their authority and civic pride. It was picked up in the Renaissance when Rome became an independent city, and it has continued to this day the symbol of a city run by its citizens for its citizens. But in ancient Rome, as the population increased, this way of running a city-state was no longer enough to make the capital work. When Rome was founded, 753 BC, and probably for the next 500 years, Rome was a city-state, just like hundreds of city-states in the Greek world, a polis. A polis run by its politei, its citizens. Rome had its cives, it was a civitas. And just as Greek has given us the word politics and everything related to it, Latin has given us citizen, city, civic, civil, even civilize. So Rome was run by its cives, its citizens, meeting down there in the forum in the central open space. But by 200 BC, Rome was expanding very rapidly, and as it acquired an empire, it became harder and harder to run as a city-state. And to cut a complicated story very short, the answer was a new form of military power, the emperor. And the emperors built their palace up there on the Palatine, and from now on, they ran Rome. But they couldn't do without their citizens. They can't ignore their citizens. And one of the major concerns of the emperors is to keep the citizen population happy. How can they get them enough food? How can they make sure there's a good water supply? How can they maintain law and order? It's much easier to see how Rome worked for its citizens than Athens, because more of the old infrastructure has survived. No ancient map exists of the Greek capital. But by contrast, there's an extraordinary piece of evidence that reveals just how the Romans designed their city to accommodate a vast and growing population. Today, this great wall is the outside wall of a church, the Church of St. Cosmas and Damian. In antiquity, it was the inside wall of a vast imperial building. And on it, there was a fantastic thing, a map of the city of Rome. It was on marble slabs. You can still see the fixing holes for those slabs. And the map spread over the whole wall. On it was depicted the city of Rome in great detail. Alas, those slabs are terribly damaged and broken today. We've only got about 1/10 of them. But it's enough to be able to reconstruct in a lot of detail the street plan of ancient Rome. One of the fascinating things we can see from that is that the street plan of the city of Rome in many points corresponded precisely to the street plan that survives today. The modern Via Cavour is 6 or 7 meters above the older street level. And here we're in the Suburra, famed in ancient Rome as being the slum district. But though it was a slum district, here we have the Via Urbana, and it follows exactly the course of the ancient Roman Vicus Patricius, which was in fact one of the most snobbish streets in town. The surviving fragments were rediscovered as far back as 1562. But 4 centuries later, scholars are still trying to puzzle out where each piece of this vast jigsaw belongs. What enables us to place the fragments of the marble plan in this area of town is this road, the Via delle Zoccolette. Its long curve is created by the curve of the Tiber River just beyond us. And on the fragments we find a street with a long curve, and it fits. What it reveals is an area nearly 3 miles long and 2 miles wide, including many landmarks that we know today.
Though the streets are mapped and monitored by the authorities far more closely in our era, it's still a struggle to make densely populated cities work, with all the challenges we have today, like terrible traffic. In one place at least, it's taken 2,000 years to catch up, as the current mayor of Rome, who's just pedestrianised the area around the Colosseum, explains.
It was black for the pollution
Yes.
that we had,
Yeah.
and you know, it cost about 25 million euros to clean it up. And now you can see the stones as they were 2,000 years ago.
For us, one of the interesting things is that already the ancient Romans had the same problems. Julius Caesar closed the forum to traffic, didn't he?
Exactly.
Do you think of yourself as the new Julius Caesar?
No.
Ancient Rome, like modern Rome, was densely populated. This was reflected not just in its traffic, but in every aspect of life. It had its forum. It had piazzas with shops. And of course, it had its housing. To help me fill in the gaps about how and where ancient Romans lived, I've been joined by my colleague from Cambridge, Tiziana D'Angelo.
So I guess we have Mussolini to thank for clearing the space.
Without trains and buses, Rome's population had to live centrally. To solve the problem of housing 1 million+ people, the Romans built upwards. This is an ancient apartment block, or insula.
I think it's amazing because below the modern ground level, we've got 2 entire floors.
And don't forget the 3 floors up there.
Yeah. 5 floors in all of ancient Roman apartment
So
blocks.
2,000 years old.
It shows how you can do dense housing in the heart of a city, doesn't it?
We may reckon that this apartment block was home to up to 200 people, one of thousands of complexes housing Rome's burgeoning population.
What I love is that this isn't just a bit of archaeology. It's a bit of living history. There have been people living here right up till 1932.
Insulae are often portrayed as dark, miserable, cramped slums. But is that really true?
So this looks like one unit of an apartment.
Well, there are quite a few of them. There's actually about 4.
Okay, we've got 4,
Yes.
and we've got them on 5 floors, so this is just one standard unit. It's not bad in terms of size, is it?
It's not small. It's
No,
quite
no.
spacious.
We've got, what is it, 4 meters by 9, 36 square meters?
It's much bigger than the average apartment nowadays.
People have this image of how Romans lived in apartment buildings in complete squalor, in tiny little pokey apartments. You've got filth on the floors, you've got bare walls. Is this life in a Roman apartment?
Well, you have to use a little bit of imagination. There is no reason why these walls or this ceiling could not be decorated when they were built. So, for example, look at the ceiling. We do have traces of plaster. So probably the whole ceiling and all the walls were plastered.
Yeah.
But we could do something more for you if you're difficult. So we could decorate
I'm
it
a
a bit.
demanding client here.
We could decorate a bit further. For example, that back wall, that main wall, 2nd century, we could paint it. Those red and yellow panels
Yep.
that were so stylish. No,
What are you going to do with the floors?
Well, we'll clean it up a bit. And then we could have something like what we have in the corridor outside, that opus picatum, so the herringbone pattern, which is very resistant on the one hand, and it looks relatively pretty. That's
Okay,
called
suppose I'm the tenant, I'm moving in, and I say, excuse me, landlord, I really don't like this floor at all. I want a proper mosaic floor.
Not far away, there are remains of decoration. It looks like a modern building.
Biblioteca Centrale
This is a
Ragazzi.
kids' library. It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful.
Oh my God. Okay, so what is going on here?
I think we've got some serious Roman bricks.
Yeah, it's much more regular.
Houses in Rome, like any city, were continually changing, with new owners doing their own makeovers.
Look at these mosaics.
Yes, it's sort of psychedelic, isn't it? It's as if someone's been trying to balance ostrich eggs on top of each other and they're all taking a tumble.
Well, in the
What's
2nd century AD, this would have been quite fashionable, actually. It's a black and white mosaic. And yes, you're right. The pattern is not a masterpiece, and you can also see that from the size of the tesserae. They're quite big. It's over 1 centimeter. But still, the mosaicists were taking a long time to make these works, and they were paid quite well. They were paid 65 denarii per day. That's quite a bit.
That's an enormous amount. That's way over a legionary's pay.
Well, it's an excellent floor, though.
Great work if you can get it. And you need more than a mosaicist, don't you? You need a plumber.
Yes,
I do want running water in my apartment, please. And lo and behold.
Yes.
We have a pipe running through. So presumably this means that at least in some rooms there is piped water.
It's a remarkable thought that by the 1st century AD, there were individual flats in Roman apartment blocks which were being supplied direct with running water. Something that even today isn't available in many parts of the world.
There's nothing so important for the health of a great city as clean water. Clean water to drink, clean water to wash in. One of the joys of Rome is that there are fountains with lovely fresh water everywhere. And that's down to the Renaissance popes who filled Rome with fountains like this one outside the Palazzo Farnese. Oddly enough, this particular fountain is made apart from a Roman bath. The baths of Caracalla. This ornamental bath was brought in to make a fountain. Because the Romans too, the ancient Romans, really understood the importance of fresh water, and they brought it in vast quantities. We all know that the Romans had big baths, but don't forget, the fundamental thing was they had a fresh supply of drinking water.
This was no mean feat. It required perhaps the greatest public infrastructure project ever attempted in the ancient world.
Aqueducts are one of the most vivid signs of the growth of the population of Rome. The first ones built as early as 312 BC, and one after another are added until in the end there are 11 separate aqueducts providing water. They got their water from the south of the city on the whole. The Alban Hills immediately to the south were volcanic, and that's not such good water. So they went further south to the limestone hills of the Apennines, and that meant pushing their technology, building enormously long aqueducts. This particular aqueduct, built by the Emperor Claudius, went 45 miles back. And it's an extraordinary feat of engineering to bring water 45 miles without the use of pumps. It means you have to keep it gently, gently, gently sloping down. That means building great arches across the valleys. Sometimes you build tunnels under mountains. It's not just an extraordinary engineering feat, it's also an extraordinary feat of organization. We happen to have a treatise by a chap called Frontinus. He was a Roman general. Indeed, he was the Roman general who conquered Wales. And when he'd finished beating up a few barbarians, he came back to Rome and organized the aqueducts. And he wrote down, being an extraordinarily efficient man, in absolute detail about each aqueduct, exactly how long it is, how many litres of water it carried, how many men it had in their maintenance teams, and so on and so on. And you can see the enormous administrative machine that lies behind keeping the people of Rome supplied with fresh water.
After the fall of Rome in the 5th century, the aqueducts fell into disrepair. The Renaissance popes tried to rebuild them, but even 1,000 years later couldn't match their ancient predecessors.
So the Aqua Marcia is a fantastic bit of Roman construction running at quite a high level. And here we have the Aqua Felice. A sort of concrete tube was the best that the popes could manage. Here we have its name, Aqua Felice. They're really rather proud of it. They've put a little plaque in marble. But let's not pretend it's at the same level of engineering expertise as the Roman aqueducts of antiquity.
In fact, it was only reviving the ancient Roman aqueduct system that made the spectacular fountains of Renaissance Rome possible.
The Campo dei Fiori here. In the morning, it's a flower and vegetable market. In the evening, it's where everyone comes for a drink. In antiquity, it's where the great theatre of Pompey was, and you can see it very clearly on the marble plan of Rome. There's one more thing that really interests me about this place, and it's the best salami shop in Rome. And in fact, I'm going there right now. It was of enormous importance to emperors to keep the citizens fed. 250,000 citizens got free grain under Augustus. But gradually, emperors added other offers. They got free oil. In 270, the Emperor Aurelian, he's the guy who built the great walls around Rome, he added a pork ration. 5 pounds of pork a head per month they got. In total, 3 million pounds of pork per annum were consumed at the emperor's expense. And Rome, ancient Rome, was full of pork butchers, suarii. And that tradition has lingered on. Che bella aria, che bel profumo.
Oh, Andrea, buonasera!
The ancient Romans loved sausages. Me too. I often used to come here when I lived in Rome, and Benedetto's always up for a bit of banter.
Ma questo è un negozio molto vecchio, se ho capito bene. Risale all'antichità, agli imperatori romani. Sì.
Sì, siamo i loro discendenti.
Discendenti di loro, i suoi. Ma se così, dovete offrirmi 5 libbre di carne.
Allora, eccole per te, 5 libbre di carne.
Ah, benissimo, accetto, accetto. E la porzione per un mese.
Questa qui è la porzione per una settimana per te.
Per me sì. Siamo un po' cresciuti nel
Come va?
frattempo.
Tutto bene, sì. È stato un piacere. Alla prossima allora.
Piacere enorme. Questa è la mia razione da cittadino romano.
Ciao Andrea. Ciao.
Just 5 minutes' walk from here, and marked on the marble map were the riverside docks of the ancient city. It was an area of warehouses, shops, and private dwellings, as it is today. Often the modern houses and businesses, like this restaurant, are built on top of ancient ones.
Buonasera, benvenuto all'Osteria Romana.
Roberto!
Welcome.
Che piacere!
Welcome.
Che cosa mi hai portato?
A little prosecco.
Oh, a
As a
little
cake.
prosecco, fantastic. Gli antichi romani, su questa strada, se non mi sbaglio, ci sono tantissime tracce di loro.
Sì, questa è la verità.
Anche qui?
Sì, anche qua sotto abbiamo molte cose belle.
Oh,
sì,
che cosa
nella
c'avete?
cantina.
Nella
Sono delle
cantina?
cose simpaticissime, che le devi vedere, che sono delle cose molto belle.
I suspected as much, because every place I've ever been into here has got yet another bit of ancient Rome. Dove andiamo?
Andiamo qui sotto, c'è un po' di disordine qua però.
This restaurant is built 20 feet above the ancient ground level. So, who knows what treasures lie below?
This is what I was hoping for. Little door down to the cellar.
Vedi, questo è un vecchio pavimento.
What do we have? What do we
La
have?
luce dappertutto.
Si respira la muffa. You can smell the antiquity. But this is amazing. Oh my God. There's a wee beastie down there. I think it's a horse. No? Is it a horse? It's a hippocamp. And there's someone, that's a nymph riding a seahorse. Absolutely fantastic. That is a better piece of mosaic than in the official excavations just behind.
Quello è il primo livello perché ci sono altri 3 livelli sotto quello e questo è il quarto.
Fantastic one. He's saying that's not all there is because there are 3 further levels down below it. And that's Rome. That's the heart of Rome. Dig down and you will find antiquity, and you find it at many levels.
The population of Rome was so vast that even 2,000 years of history couldn't bury it all below ground level.
Well, here I am standing on top of a ginormous Roman rubbish heap, an ancient Roman rubbish heap. This is 50 meters and more above the modern street level. That means, as we look around, there's not a single rooftop that even comes up near the height of this. And it's enormous. Going around it, it's more than a kilometre in circumference. That means it's the equivalent of something like 6 urban blocks. And it's not any old rubbish. This is quite specialised rubbish. Let's have a look at it. It is entirely composed of these things, terracotta fragments from pots called amphorae.
It's been estimated that this hill is composed of 50 million amphorae.
So we know an enormous amount about Roman amphorae. They're terribly distinctive. And they all come in different shapes and sizes from all the corners of the Mediterranean. And the archaeologists have studied these, and what you need to do, that's a bit of the bottom, but it's much better to get one of these. Now that is a rim, and that gives you the dimensions of the amphora. Or you look for a handle. There's a nice handle. And you can pin them down, and the archaeologists say that these are all from Spain, from South Spain, from Baetica, and they all contained olive oil. And what do they need this prodigious amount of olive oil for? After all, there's a limit to how many salads you can eat. But it's not just for cooking. It's also for illumination. They don't have any electricity. They have little lamps which they fill up with olive oil. And it's also for washing. There's no soap. So for cleaning, you cover your body with olive oil and scrape it down. So they get through enormous quantities of this olive oil. So our rubbish heap is on a great bend in the Tiber River. You can just about make it out down there, that line of trees, and it goes right round us and round there. And this whole area down below us was full of warehouses. And round the corner, this particular stuff, these olive oil amphorae, probably came from the Horia Galbana, Galba's warehouses, which is actually marked on the map of Rome.
The Tiber flows through the heart of modern Rome, just as it did in ancient times. But there were big differences between the river then and now.
Today, the Tiber is flanked on both sides by massive embankments. These were built in the late 19th century to stop the city from flooding. In antiquity, there were no embankments, and they had terrible problems with flooding, but they used the river. In antiquity, the river was buzzing with activity. There were boats coming up and down. You don't see a single boat on the Tiber today. There were hundreds of boats bringing up merchandise, grain, wine, oil, and luxury goods, of course, to the hundreds of warehouses that lined the banks of the river.
But for Rome to function for 1 million people, the Tiber could only work as part of a much bigger transport system. With Rome expanding its trade links to cater for an increasing population, centres were established to handle the huge amount of imported produce heading to the capital.
One of the places you get the most vivid idea of the sheer scale and complexity of the trade that supplies Rome with food is here in Ostia. What we have is an enormous piazza with a sort of covered walkway here, and behind it a series of offices. And this is where the shippers and traders do their business. And they put up sort of publicity signs. This is a picture of the River Nile and its delta. Egypt and Alexandria were one of the most important sources of trade in the empire. Here we have a rather nice picture of how you do the shipping. You come into harbour with a big ship, and there's a guy on the gangplank bringing over an amphora, which is moving onto a smaller ship, which is then going to go upriver to the warehouses in Rome. Then over here, we've got a rather nice scene of the lighthouse. Of course, when you're coming across the Mediterranean and you see the great lighthouse, you know you've made it at last. And there are a couple of ships, dolphins, and so on. And here we can see just where they come from. Here we have the naviculari, the shippers, and the negotiantes, the businessmen of Caralis, that's Cagliari in Sardinia. And remember, it's not just one trade. Some people own the ships, some people do the negotiation, do the business, because there is a lot of money both to make and to lose in shipping. And you can just imagine, this place would be full of hundreds of traders trying to do a little deal. One of the interesting things is they're all private. They're doing it for the state. They're doing it because Rome needs corn, but individuals can make a packet out of it. Here are the people, isn't this wonderful? This elephant saying you are in North Africa and they are from Sabratha in Libya. That whole coast of North Africa supplying Rome with corn, but also with other goods. And this is the place where trade happens. This is the place you come and make a fortune.
Ostia was such a lucrative hub for trade that it flourished as a town in its own right. And you can still see the trappings of wealth in the buildings and decoration. The wealth and global trade coming into Rome by the 1st century meant Ostia couldn't cope. Ancient Rome had to adapt and expand further. And 2 miles north of Ostia, it embarked upon a monumental piece of infrastructure to sustain its burgeoning city, at the very site of modern Italy's greatest transport hub.
Well, here we are, right by the hurly-burly of Rome's Fiumicino airport. Traffic whizzing past all the time, low-flying planes whizzing overhead, sometimes hard to make yourself heard. And yet, this is one of the least well-known but most important of Roman sites. It's the great port of Rome that the Romans simply called Portus, the port. Now, Rome didn't have a natural harbour. The Tiber comes out into the sea and it doesn't have a bay around it. Think of Athens. They had the Piraeus, a natural harbour. Rome had to make a harbour artificially, overcoming natural obstacles. And that took the resources of empire. It took the Emperor Claudius, and these columns are very typical of constructions by the Emperor Claudius, who cared about infrastructure. He cared about chunky, practical building. And he made a vast artificial harbour at the mouth of the Tiber.
Along with the harbour came all the surrounding buildings and warehouses. To get a sense of the scale of this place, I've come to meet my old friend Simon Kay, who's made a remarkable discovery.
Well, my Simon, you've been busy bees.
We certainly have,
It's quite a hole you've made in this poor beauty spot.
What Simon has excavated is just a tiny element in a whole network of ship installations. This trench represents just part of one bay in what was a massive complex.
This bay would originally have been just under 60 metres long. So that's actually 3 of these. You have to imagine them stacked against one another.
Way down there.
And it's just under 12 metres wide.
Height?
Height, well, are you prepared for it? This is a building which stands to at least, well, a maximum of 18 metres, which is somewhere up there.
At the top of the trees? Okay.
So this is truly massive, and it's meant to be seen. It's a statement about what the Romans are able to do in creating a facade that reflects Roman power and has a great functional use and so on.
What we're seeing is just a third of one ship bay. Imagine, this 18-metre-high construction would have been a tiny part of a complex that could berth at least 500 ships. It gives us a glimpse of that remarkable scale the port was built on. The site occupies a staggering 860 acres, part of which is now the stately home of Duke Sforza Cesarini, who feels a strong connection with his Roman past.
Posso chiedere quanto è importante per lei personalmente conservare l'antichità romana?
Beh, molto. Il senso storico e l'abitudine a convivere con le cose del passato, uno c'è nato dentro e quindi mi sento assolutamente di dovere, per quel che posso, tutelare, preservare e valorizzare, mantenere. Sì. Penso di sì, sì, ce l'ho. È molto forte in me.
Claudius built Portus because Ostia became too small for Rome. But trade grew so fast that the harbour had to be enlarged again in the 2nd century by Trajan. A new 80-acre basin was constructed. It was recorded that it was formed in the shape of a huge hexagon to maximise the berthing space for ships. You get little idea of this from the ground. There's only one way to find out.
Wow, fantastic.
Yeah, that's what we wanted.
From 500 meters in the air, you can clearly make out the sides of Trajan's hexagon.
Luckily enough, the Emperor Claudius left his mark in the shape of this inscription here, which explains a bit about what he thought he was doing in making his great port. Like all imperial inscriptions, it starts with his name in enormous letters. Tiberius, Claudius, son of Drusus, Caesar, and then a whole load of titles that go on for a couple of lines. And then he explains what he's up to. Fossis ductis, I dug canals from the Tiber in order to support my works on the port. And by doing so, he says, letting them out into the sea, I saved the city of Rome from the danger of flooding. So he sees his engineering works as a whole package. It's not just that he creates a port, he links the port to the city by the canals, and the canals save the city from the danger of flooding.
Like this one, known as Fiumicino, or Little River, it gives its name to Rome's airport nearby. And though it dates from the time of Claudius, it's still fully functioning. And even 400 years before these canals were completed, the Romans had grasped the importance of drainage in their city.
One of the vital steps of turning Rome into a city from just a cluster of villages was to create a great drain, the Cloaca Maxima. The original settlements were on hilltops, the Palatine Hill, the Capitoline Hill, and between them was an enormous swamp, a river flowing down and spreading out. To get from one hilltop to another, you had to use a boat. And it's one of the first kings of Rome, you could call him a tyrant, Tarquin, who famously created the Cloaca Maxima, the great drain of Rome. And what that great drain does is get rid of the swamp and create a dry area which was to become the forum, the heart of the city. But the Cloaca Maxima served other purposes too, and progressively all sorts of stuff was sent down into the great drain and it turned into a great sewer.
So, what's all this? Okay. Crikey. Right. So another arm. That's another arm. Oh, it's rather small. Right. That'll keep the shit out. The Cloaca runs nearly a mile from north to south, traversing ancient and modern Rome underground. The Greek writer Strabo said the sewer was wide enough to drive a cart loaded with hay. And I can't argue with that. It is huge. I've come to meet the head of the archaeological team looking at the Cloaca, Dr. Luca Antonioli.
Ah, l'imperatore Domiziano.
L'imperatore Domiziano.
E siamo proprio sotto il foro.
Qui siamo sotto il foro di Nerva.
Tutta questa costruzione che non è in laterizio.
Ha insieme una parte in tufo, una parte in laterizio, in bipedali, e tutta la volta fatta in cementizio, in opera cementizia.
And you can see the wooden shuttering on which it was poured. What I love about Roman cement is this was poured in AD 100 or so, and it's still as solid and serviceable. It works for the sewers of Rome today. It doesn't need any form of repair.
It's remarkable that the Cloaca Maxima survived, whilst the rest of Rome was crumbling. Over time, as the greatness of the city began to fade, and the forum above was built over with the houses of a later Rome, the Cloaca was forgotten.
La cloaca viene sepolta, cioè viene tutta riempita di materiale fino alla volta, tanto che nel 1500 sopra qua viene fatta un'altra fogna che ha lo stesso percorso della cloaca, senza sapere che sotto ce n'era un'altra.
They build new drains because they don't even realize this drain is running underneath. And it's not until the 19th century, when Rome becomes a capital city, that they rediscover and reactivate the great sewers of ancient Rome.
Rome's sewers, like its aqueducts, were an attempt to tackle the public health of a city which had topped 1 million people. But daily life was not the only challenge. So was death and the problem of burial. This may look like a park shed, but there's more to it than meets the eye. From the 2nd century BC onwards, cremation had become increasingly popular at funerals. Little wonder, with a rising urban population and space at a premium.
I have to say, this is one of my favorite Roman tombs. It's called the Columbarium of Pomponius Hillas.
Well, as we discovered as we were coming down the stairs, but Pomponius, was he the owner of this tomb? He wasn't, right?
No, he's clearly not. There's a beautiful mosaic with his name and griffins around a lyre. It's charming, but it's quite clear he was one of the last people to be buried in here. The first guy's got to be this guy, hasn't it? Or the first couple, because there's the man and his wife.
And they got a most prominent location as well, probably not by the stairway, but on the main wall. And they built themselves this really nice and large niche.
And you've got him and his wife depicted on the wall.
And look at the material. They look like alabaster ash urns, which was very expensive.
Yeah, you pay a lot.
Yeah, because they probably actually paid for this whole thing. They took care of the entire decoration on this ceiling and here in the apsis. You can see similar style.
So I think we have to assume these are people he's made a packet, and yet he's not one of the Roman nobles, is he? The whole Roman fashion for having grand, ostentatious tombs starts with the Roman nobility. But by the time we're here in the 1st century AD, the sort of people who are being buried are actually ex-slaves. This guy is Granius Nestor. Nestor, a sort of Greek mythological name. A freeborn man could have it, but it's very improbable. And his wife's called Hedone, which means Hedone, Mrs. Pleasure. That is a very characteristic slave name, isn't it?
They also present themselves in a very Roman way. Look at him. They are wearing a toga, holding a scroll. It could be the sort of image that they want to project of themselves, of good Roman citizens. They're really showing that they made it in a way. They made it in their circle. And look at it. Look at what they got.
The use of colour is fantastic, isn't it?
I mean, that was Egyptian blue, one of the most expensive pigments that you could possibly get in antiquity. So that already tells us something. It's not like the other niches. They are just yellow and red, which are natural colors, so way less expensive. You want to project the same values that you have in real life also here. You want to be able to see it in the commemorations that perhaps were held here every year. So that's what you want the living to see and to commemorate you for.
This tomb has over 100 niches for the ashes of those laid to rest. The word columbarium comes from the Latin meaning dovecot.
They come from a city that's densely populated.
Yes.
There are tens of thousands of other people like them, and they don't even dream of having a tomb all to themselves. They build it with lots and lots of slots for lots of other people. It's a bit like an insular block, isn't it? You can see them
like
stacking up, and they're all packed in like sardines, because in a really crowded city, you live stacked up in apartment blocks, and you die stacked up in columbaria.
Every great city depends on immigration. It needs it for numbers, it needs it for cheap labor, it needs it for specialist services. Modern Rome, and here we are near the station in an area full of immigrants. Bangladeshis, Chinese, Africans, Romanians, all sorts. Modern Rome couldn't function without its immigrants, and it's just the same in ancient Rome. Unlike modern Europe, in ancient Rome, there's no limitation on immigration. And indeed, there is compulsory immigration. Slavery means that tens, even hundreds of thousands of people are brought from all over the world to Rome. And then there are plenty who come voluntarily. Free men, citizens, they come to Rome to make their fortune.
The city had a massive draw. Unlike the provinces, Rome was a tax-free zone, and its citizens received free handouts of food and sometimes even money. Under the Emperor Augustus, Rome became the biggest place of employment in the ancient world, with public services which wouldn't be matched for another 1800 years. Amazingly, this even included a professional fire service of 7,000 men.
The most important thing that Augustus did to protect Rome from fire was to set up a fire brigade. It was a quasi-military organization with 7 cohorts. This is an inscription put up by the 5th cohort. In each cohort, there are 1,000 men. Those 7 cohorts controlled the 14 regions of Rome. So each cohort is split in 2 and does 2 regions. Here we have an inscription from cohort number 5. And these 3 guys at the top in the biggest letters are the most important.
the prefect, Gaius Julius Quintilianus, the sub-prefect, Marcus Firmius Ambitianus, and then there's a tribune, and then these guys are the centurions. And one of the intriguing things about them is each of them gives where they came from. Now, you'd expect the Fire Brigade of Rome to be locally recruited, but no. This guy comes from a place called Berva, which is near Venice. This guy comes from Severia, which is in Hungary. This one from Ratiaria, which is in Bulgaria. This one from Poetovio in Slovenia. And this one from Aquincum, which is Budapest in Hungary. So they come from way, way east of Rome. That's not all. You then flip round the other side, and then you get all the names of the ordinary vigiles, all 1,000 of them, in teeny little letters, column after column.
Under the Emperor Nero in 64 AD, the vigiles were put to the test when a great fire swept Rome. It was a disaster. Notoriously, the emperor was blamed for fiddling whilst Rome burned. What the cause of the fire was can be debated, but what's certain is how Nero responded afterwards.
We're underneath the street level of modern Rome and under a multiplex cinema. When they were constructing this, they were trying to go further down to add extra rooms. And what they found was they were blocked by a massive bit of Roman building. What we have here is two entire urban blocks back to back with each other. There were at least 3 floors in this insula. We know from the brick stamps, Romans like to stamp their bricks with their names, we know from those that it was built under the Emperor Nero. What we can see here are the dividing walls of the 2 blocks. And Nero said, you're not allowed to use party walls. You can't build one block against another. You've got to have separate walls because that stops the fire spreading.
During the Great Fire, the vigiles had complained of a lack of water to fight the flames. Nero decreed that every insula must have access to a cistern with an abundant water supply. Despite his reforms, the myth about Nero lives on to this day. The modern fire service takes its name from the vigiles, and their ancient counterparts are still celebrated.
Well, here is a fine-looking group of vigiles, the standard bearer, and a pretty tough lot they look. I don't think I would want to mess with them. And we have here the centurion, Simone, grande piacere,
piacere mio.
Complimenti.
Grazie.
Mi puoi fare capire qual era l'attrezzatura che serviva per loro?
Beh, l'attrezzatura dei vigili, sì, diciamo che da allora a adesso non è cambiata molto. Avevano degli attrezzi che servivano soprattutto per la demolizione degli edifici.
Nel caso che il rischio che il fuoco si estende.
Certo, certo. Allora, venivano per demolire, utilizzavano questi martelli oppure l'ascia romana, che è questa.
A Roman axe.
Sì.
Wow, wow, this is one scary bit of kit. This would be through the woodwork in no time. E per spegnere il fuoco, come lo fate?
Utilizzavano queste. Questi sono i centones. Sono pezzi di stoffa fatti con il residuato della lavorazione della lana. Senti com'è dura?
Fabulous. A Roman fire blanket, which you make of a patchwork of wool.
Li bagnavano dentro le botti in acqua e aceto e andavano a spegnere le fiamme.
So this you dip in water, but also vinegar, because vinegar has an important fire retardant effect.
Water was transported from the cisterns using amphorae.
Bravissimo.
Yes, I can imagine it might be bit hard to extinguish a fire just chucking it straight from the amphora.
But the Vigiles had a secret weapon, a hydraulic pump called a siphon.
Questa funziona in questo modo, ha due pistoni. Allora veniva inserita l'acqua e pressurizzata l'aria. Ecco che l'acqua andava in pressione.
So you have two tubes. One sucks the water in, then it passes into the piston, and as the water goes in, the air is under pressure, and then as you send the valves up and down, the water squirts out both sides. Bravissimo.
Grazie.
Allora, il vostro gruppo c'ha un motto?
Certo, è il motto dei vigili da 2000 anni.
Ah.
Vigiles! Ubi dolor!
Vigiles! Fantastico.
Nero's Vigiles were a semi-military organisation and also had a policing role. Together with other paramilitary forces, there were no less than 20,000 men dedicated to keeping Rome's citizens safe. The principles of policing have remained the same in modern Rome, though the technology has changed. CCTV performs many of the surveillance duties done by the Vigiles. But though the Romans didn't possess digital mapping, they did understand that planning, just as in so many spheres of Roman life, was the key to making their city work. The only private house marked on the former urbis is the residence of the urban prefect, Fabius Caelo, the man responsible for Rome's forces of law and order. It seems very possible that the document that has helped us understand the plan of ancient Rome was in fact displayed in the office of their chief of police.
Already under Augustus, the population of Rome had reached 1 million, and it probably stayed at more or less the same level for the next 300, even 400 years. It's not until the imperial power of Rome implodes that the population also collapses. By the middle of the 6th century, it may have shrunk to as few as 30,000 people. And no city in Europe was again to reach the figure of 1 million until the beginning of the 19th century.
You're looking at it now. By no coincidence, London too was capital of a world empire, and made no disguise of the act it was following. Yet Rome had achieved 1 million when the world population was a fraction of its modern size, and without motor transport, gas or electricity. Today we live in a world of megacities, but Rome remains the inspiration for them all.
Bettany Hughes' series on ancient philosophy is well worth a look. It's available now on BBC iPlayer. Next here, India season continues. We consider what the future holds for the world's busiest railway.